Have you ever wondered how a piece of paper or a metal coin can become money, circulate in the market, and be used to buy bread or other goods? What ultimately gives that paper or metal coin its value? What is it anchored to? What standard or foundation does it rest upon? From labor to commodities, then to value forms, and finally the circulation of money. What is the key link in this development chain that has shaped our understanding and created the objective phenomenon we know today? The harder you work, the more capital increases in value. In other words, why is it that as labor productivity increases, the pressure of life does not lessen, but seems to intensify? Is the root cause simply overproduction or reduced liquidity? What is the real contradiction between commodities, labor, and capital? It is from this point that Capital, Karl Marx's classic work, begins its foundational analysis. In a society dominated by the capitalist mode of production, wealth appears in the form of an immense collection of commodities, and each individual commodity is a building block of that wealth. Marx began with these lines: "A commodity is in the first place an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. Whether those wants are real or imagined, based on survival or desire, doesn't change the nature of the commodity." To those unfamiliar with academic theory, these concepts might sound abstract or inaccessible. So in this section, we will try to use concrete examples to make the ideas easier to grasp. Let's start with a simple image. The commodity is the basic unit of capitalist production. Starting from the concept of the commodity helps us understand its essence and the origins of the value theory. In layman's terms, the commodity is the cell of the capitalist production system. A commodity has two properties: use value and exchange value, the two essential components that make up a commodity. Use value refers to the natural property of a commodity, its ability to satisfy a specific human need. Use value is specific and varies depending on the physical characteristics of each type of commodity. For instance, the use value of a coat is to keep warm. The use value of a water bottle is to be drunk. Therefore, use value is tied closely to the material form of the commodity and can only be realized through consumption. However, despite its importance, in a capitalist economy, use value is secondary. That's because under capitalism, production is not aimed at meeting specific social needs, but at generating surplus value, in other words, profit. This leads to a situation where use value becomes merely a prerequisite for a commodity to enter the realm of exchange. Let's use a real-world example to illustrate this. While simple items are easy to understand, many people find it challenging to grasp when it comes to more complex real-life situations. Now, let's take a look at a job interview from a capitalist perspective. In essence, it is a process where many people, as commodities, are evaluated to see whether they meet the company's needs. That is, whether they have use value. This is only the initial threshold. Only if you possess the appropriate use value will you be called for an interview. But in the logic of the capitalist labor market, what the employer truly cares about lies elsewhere. Once use value is confirmed, the next consideration is whether that person can create additional value for the company in the future. For instance, someone might have excellent expertise, but if they are unwilling to perform value-generating activities, like finding clients or driving revenue, they are less competitive than someone with average skills who is willing to set aside pride and reach out to customers. This is one of the core truths of capitalism. While use value is important, under the logic of surplus value, it is often overshadowed or instrumentalized. This logic doesn't just apply to commodities, it deeply influences behaviors and operational models in the modern workplace. That's why many young people today feel trapped between personal values and performance expectations. The wolf culture, widely criticized today, stems from this very phenomenon. At its core, this culture uses flowery names and selfish slogans to mask the reality that humans are being turned into instruments of capital accumulation. Meanwhile, the value of a commodity is the abstract form of generalized human labor condensed into it. It reflects the exchange relationship between products of social labor. Therefore, the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. This method of calculation enables commodities to be exchanged on an equivalent basis. Because value becomes the common measure in commodity exchange, The exchange equation only holds when both sides contain equal amounts of socially necessary labor time, like the two sides of a scale that balances only when the same weight is placed on both. At this point, many people might wonder, what is the difference between value and use value? Take the example of a coat. Its value does not depend on its ability to keep you warm, i.e., its use value, but on the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. From this, we see that value is not only a social attribute of the commodity, but also the foundation of its exchangeability, and it stands in contrast to the specific nature of use value. A commodity is not merely a material object that meets human needs, but also a representation of social relationships. Now, someone might ask, if the value of a commodity depends on labor time, doesn't that mean the lazier or less skilled someone is, the more valuable their product becomes because it takes them longer to make it? The answer, from the capitalist point of view, is no. The value of a commodity is not determined by the actual labor time of an individual, but by the socially necessary labor time, the average time under current production conditions. For example, a skilled tailor may need only 2 hours to sew a standard quality shirt, while a less experienced tailor might take 4 hours. But if the societal standard is 2 hours, then the value of the shirt is still calculated as 2 hours of labor. Regardless of the longer time the less skilled tailor takes, their product doesn't become more valuable. It's like a race. The winner isn't the one who tires the most, but the one who finishes first. Based on this, if we dig deeper, we'll see that as labor productivity increases, the socially necessary labor time decreases, which means the value of the commodity also falls. As Marx wrote, the higher the labor productivity, the less time it takes to produce 1 unit of a commodity. Thus, the amount of labor embodied in the product is smaller, and so is its value. Conversely, if productivity is low, it takes more time to produce the same item, and its value increases accordingly. In other words, the value of a commodity is directly proportional to the labor embodied in it, but inversely proportional to labor productivity. This explains why, during certain historical periods under capitalism, where efficiency and results are central to societal priorities, traditional handicrafts are gradually pushed aside and disappear. For instance, take 2 teacups. Both serve the same purpose, to drink tea. One is handcrafted, taking months or more to complete, while the other is mass-produced by machines in just a few hours. When comparing the two, the longer production time of the handmade cup does not increase its value under capitalist logic. It wasn't until the modern era that people began moving away from this materialistic capitalist mindset and started to realize that the inefficient extra time actually represents intangible cultural heritage. It carries cultural depth and historical value. Only then did society begin to redefine and grant it special worth. Now that we understand the two elements of a commodity, we can explore the concept of the twofold nature of labor, because these two ideas correspond to each other. Specifically, concrete labor creates use value, while abstract labor creates exchange value. Concrete labor refers to labor that produces use value. It is particular and specific. In contrast, abstract labor represents value. It is the expenditure of human labor power in general, regardless of occupation, skill, or tools. This gives rise to the first contradiction, the opposition between use value and exchange value, which is also the internal contradiction within a commodity. We can see that use value is specific and individual, whereas value is abstract and universal. As a product of labor, the commodity simultaneously embodies both aspects. It is the result of concrete labor and the crystallization of abstract labor. This opposition reflects the separation between the material and social dimensions of capitalist production. A commodity, while fulfilling human needs, also becomes a tool for value exchange and capital accumulation. This means a commodity is not merely a physical entity, but a form that expresses social relationships. In other words, the value form of a commodity is the objectification of social relations in capitalist production. It conceals the direct relationships between producers beneath a web of interactions between things, that is, between commodities. Elimination. And within this process of exchange, another deep contradiction gradually emerges. Although each commodity has its own use value and unique production process, they can still be exchanged on the market as if they were equivalent. This kind of exchange blurs or even completely obscures the social relationships between people, replacing them with relationships between things. Human relationships become reified, turning into relationships between commodities, the most evident manifestation of alienation in capitalism. It's just like in many workplaces today, where employers often don't care how much personal time or effort you invested to win a project. The only thing they care about is the final result, the profit. When you complete the project and mention how hard it was, how much private time you sacrificed, and that you need rest as compensation, all you receive is a cold response. That's your job. The fact that you spent more time than others only proves one thing: you're less competent. Looking back, you may find that all the credit for the project was taken by your boss, who then spins an inspirational success story, constantly telling new employees how he worked hard, strived forward, and always gave his best. And it all sounds so believable. But behind this method of commodity exchange lies a concealed reality: that social production relations have been replaced by relationships between commodities. This is one of the core features of the capitalist mode of production. It renders social relationships vague, fogged over. The consequence, simply put, is that people are turned into one-dimensional beings, stripped of their wholeness and gradually instrumentalized, becoming tools or objects serving the capitalist machine. Once we understand this mechanism of obscuring social relationships, we can begin to analyze the fundamental logic of money and capitalist circulation. As shown in the example above, although different commodities can be exchanged on an equal basis, it's inconvenient to do so, especially with bulky items that are hard to carry around. So can we use something more convenient, a medium, to represent the value of commodities? That is the origin of money. However, it's important to note that this is an oversimplified explanation, as it omits a crucial factor: the process of assigning value to that medium. Let's now consider the development of the commodity value form, the historical premise for the birth of money. This process includes 4 stages. The first stage is the simple value form or individual value form. In this form, the value of a commodity is directly expressed through its exchange with another commodity. For example, 6 bags of rice can be exchanged for 1 sheep. This is a form of direct exchange. In this exchange, rice is the commodity expressing its value, and the sheep is the object through which that value is expressed. This is known as the relative value form. The sheep in this case serves as the measure, the equivalent form. It does not need to express its own value but merely reflects the value of the other commodity. However, this form had a clear limitation. The exchange relationships were random, direct, and only applicable in local transactions involving a few specific commodities. Not everyone agreed on the equivalence of items. Some goods weren't accepted as exchange items. As commodity exchange expanded, the value of one item was no longer expressed through just one other commodity, but through many. This marked the transition to the second stage, the expanded value form. For example, a shirt could be exchanged for 20 kilograms of wheat or 5 fish. We can see that the value of a commodity could now be expressed through multiple different goods, reflecting the growing complexity of exchange relations. However, these were still specific, many-to-many exchanges without a unified standard for value representation. This changed in the third stage, the emergence of the general equivalent form. This was a historic leap in the development of commodity exchange relations. For instance, salt has long been a valuable item. In many regions, it was strictly controlled, a sign of its rarity and value. So, take salt as an example. 1 kilogram of salt could be exchanged for 20 kilograms of wheat, or 5 fish, or 3 shirts. You'll notice that all commodities could express their value through salt. Salt, now widely accepted and scarce, could be exchanged for almost anything. At this point, the monetary form began to take shape. By then, the commodity exchange process began to bear the primitive traits of money. The key feature of this stage was, when a specific commodity is accepted as the general equivalent, the value relations among commodities are widely acknowledged by society. The historical significance of this stage lies in the fact that it transformed exchange relations from random to universal, allowing commodities to realize their value across broader contexts. Over time, this form evolved into what we now know as money. In the money form stage, a specific commodity, such as gold or silver, was fixed as the universal standard for expressing value. It became the general equivalent for the entire world of commodities. Money not only served as a medium of exchange, but also took on other functions, such as storing value and measuring value. Here we can further explore the concept of money. Many may wonder, if money is essentially just a medium, what makes it universally accepted? In other words, what stands behind this recognition? Why does something called money hold value? To answer this, let's look at models from different countries. First, consider our own currency. It's issued by the state and backed by sovereign authority. This is sovereign money. It is supported by national credit, issued by the central bank, and backed by factors like the size of the economy, foreign exchange reserves, gold reserves, production capacity, etc. Therefore, this currency tends to be relatively stable. However, there is one particularly special currency, the US dollar. In its early stages, the USD was directly tied to gold, with a fixed exchange rate of $35 per ounce of gold. That's why people often referred to it as the gold dollar. But in 1971, when the Bretton Woods system collapsed, the USD was no longer linked to gold and transitioned into a system of credit money. However, what's called credit money is merely a surface appearance. The true foundation of the USD lies in oil, the global payment system based on the dollar, and the military power of the United States. This is why people often speak of the weapons of oil and guns. And so today, we often see in the news that whenever a Middle Eastern country with oil interests tries to escape the USD-based payment system, it almost certainly faces sanctions, interventions, or even war. That's because breaking away from the USD is seen as a direct challenge to the foundations of American global power. The logic behind this is the logic of a global policeman backed by coercive force, a kind of excessive privilege. The US not only issues a globally liquid currency, but also benefits from seigniorage, the profit made from printing money. They can print money to transfer domestic risks into burdens for other countries, sometimes even pushing developing economies into crisis. We will continue to analyze this operating mechanism in more detail in later installments of our series on capital. For now, let's return to the development of the value form. If we look objectively, we'll see that the development of the value form is not just a historical economic phenomenon, but also a process that obscures social relationships. The value form of commodities conceals the real labor relationships between people. The social relationships among producers are replaced by reified relationships through commodity exchange. Through this process of obscuring, we can see that individual labor, once expressed through the value form of commodities, becomes transformed into social labor, silently absorbed into the functioning machine of capitalist economics. The development of the commodity value form is a manifestation of the abstraction of labor in modern society. The emergence of the monetary form marks the maturity of the commodity world, but at the same time it also reflects the alienation of labor. Labor, which is inherently a social activity, now must be expressed through an external material form: money. Meanwhile, the laboring subject, the human being, is submerged in the abstract universality of commodity exchange. From here, we can understand the concept of commodity fetishism, the idea that people mistake social relationships between humans for natural relationships between things, thereby obscuring those human relationships. For example, a luxury handbag and an ordinary bag both serve the same purpose, to carry items. But people often assign a noble value to the luxury one as if it were an inherent quality. In reality, this nobility is a social attribute subjectively assigned by humans, but we tend to forget this. People mistakenly believe that such value naturally exists within the luxury bag itself. That's why it's important for each of us to remain clear-headed in our judgment of value. Once we understand the social relationships hidden behind commodities, we can see that buying a reasonably priced item with high utility is in no way inferior to purchasing a branded product. On the contrary, those who chase after brands and believe that an item can grant them social status are actually forgetting that such perceptions are constructed social relationships. They mistakenly believe that the power of branding is absolute, when in reality, it is we who grant that power, often to compensate for some internal psychological or ego-related deficiency. And so, the fog called commodities returns to dominate us, turning us into subjects of capitalism once again. After understanding this process, we can begin to explore the function of money in greater depth. You'll realize that money is not only a form through which the value of a commodity is expressed, but also a tool that facilitates the circulation of commodities. And commodity circulation is one of the basic operational mechanisms of the capitalist mode of production. Through money, the relationships between producers and consumers, and between commodities themselves, are efficiently linked. Let's first examine the basic form of commodity circulation, expressed by the formula CMC, commodity, money, commodity. Analyzing this formula, we see that the first stage is the producer sells a commodity to receive money. In the next stage, that person uses the money to buy another commodity. The purpose of this process is to fulfill a need, in other words, to obtain use value. With money acting as a medium, individuals can complete the exchange of commodities. The endpoint of this process is the consumption of the commodity. If we remove money and rely on direct exchange, then both parties must simultaneously possess exactly what the other needs, a condition called the double coincidence of wants. For example, if you need a cup for drinking, but the other person only has a birthday cake, the exchange cannot occur. In this case, money, as a general equivalent, breaks the randomness of exchange, allowing transactions to happen independently in time and space. Buying and selling no longer have to happen simultaneously. Thanks to the storing function of money, value can be preserved and used later. This is the mediating function of money in circulation. Although the circulation of commodities may initially appear to be a simple exchange process, it actually contains many internal contradictions, especially the divergence of exchange goals and the tendency toward monetary accumulation. In the beginning, as expressed by the formula CMC, commodity, money, commodity, the purpose of exchange is to obtain another commodity. But when the goal of circulation shifts from consumption to monetary accumulation, the formula transforms into MCM, money, commodity, more money. This is the logic of speculation, seen in examples like real estate speculation, sneaker speculation, etc., and it is the foundation of capitalist circulation. The divergence of exchange goals emerges when people no longer care about commodities for their use value, but instead for their exchange value. That is, the desire to accumulate money. Since money can be converted into anything, production is no longer aimed at meeting needs but at generating more money. This leads to the tendency to hoard money, creating the conditions for capital to emerge, and simultaneously deepens the alienation in social production relationships. For example, when real estate becomes speculative, people believe property value will increase over time. The price rises due to social factors, such as demand exceeding supply or economic expectations, but many people mistakenly believe this is an inherent trait of the property. As a result, they borrow money and buy multiple houses with the aim of reselling for profit. The phenomenon of money making money emerges. Of course, this example doesn't yet address more complex practical elements like interest rates, taxes, or land rent, which we'll analyze in future chapters of Capital. Through the commodity circulation formula, we see that value is transformed from a potential state into an actual one. The value of a commodity is formed during production, but only when exchanged through money is that value realized. On one hand, the circulation of commodities provides the foundation for value to be actualized, allowing the labor of producers to be socially exchanged. On the other hand, money, as the intermediary, obscures the true nature of labor relations. The relationship between producers is replaced by the relationship between objects. While the emergence of money makes commodity circulation more efficient, it also opens the door to the capitalization of production. At this point, commodities are no longer just carriers of use value. They become tools for increasing value, tools of capital. At this stage, it's clear, commodity circulation is a necessary condition in a capitalist economy, but it is not sufficient to create capital. Only when money is transformed into capital, through the process of generating surplus value within production relations, does the true essence of capital take form. And that is what we will continue to explore in the next chapter.